So I have another video, and this is more so not so much about salvation or anything like that, but it's more so just kind of giving a little bit of a food for thought regarding a subject that doesn't really get touched on that much, or sometimes it does get touched upon, but I want to kind of give my personal perspective on it. It's not something that's like a strong opinion or anything, but I just want to just put that out there just to kind of see like what other people think and just kind of get an idea of maybe different perspectives on this idea. And so as of recent, there have been a lot of posts on Facebook, videos, different things like that. And basically, what got publicized online was the fact that Roger Jimenez stepped down from being the pastor of Verity Baptist Church. And basically, what we found out was that there was some sort of moral sin that basically disqualified him from pastoring. And then, of course, there were certain members in the church that were aware of this sin, including obviously his wife and Oliver and his wife, and it was the kind of sin where it was like very serious and very um, troubling to the point where they just felt like yeah, like he kind of has to step down, right? This is not something that's just a matter of opinion, but the sin is grievous enough such that he does need in fact to step down. And so of course he does in fact step down. That's what he did earlier this year. He was actually planning on stepping down towards the end of January, but it ended up happening a little bit earlier than expected. But either way, the point is that he stepped down. And then of course there's also another question regarding what precisely was the nature of this mortal sin, like what exactly was it, which goes to show you that he's not exactly repentant of the sin that he did. He's kind of hiding it, sweeping it under the rug, and then we have all the NDA agreements that kind of make things a little bit more interesting, for lack of a better word. And based on what I've seen online, it seems like that whatever this sin is that it's some sort of sexual sin, and it had something to do with pornography, essentially. Now, as far as the exact nature of that, as far as like what exactly he was looking at, whether it was like something like OnlyFans or just some other kind of website to look into obscene material, obviously, at that point it would just be speculation on my part. But that's more or less what would be the most reasonable, plausible conclusion based on the evidence that we have as far as like videos and testimonies from former members of Verity. Okay. Now, that being said, the reason why I wanted to make this specific video is that, kind of like at large, we can kind of just think about the general principle about what exactly would disqualify a pastor, right? Like what exactly does a pastor need to have, or let's just say more specifically, what are the kinds of sins that could disqualify a pastor from pastoring, so that way he's no longer a legitimate pastor and therefore he does need, in fact, to step down. And this is something that I've never really thought about that much, especially because personally for me, I'm not exactly interested in becoming a pastor. It's not something that I really think about, or well, in the past I used to think about it, but as of now, I don't really focus on that. It's not something that I desire. It's not something that I'm looking for. I just want to, I want to get married. I want to start a family, and I just want to be faithful to church, faithful to soul winning. At the end of the day, that's what I care about. I'm not really that interested in being a pastor, but but obviously it's a very notable goal. The Bible talks about, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. And so it's obviously a great thing that's worthy of double honor, right? But when it comes to specifically the question of like, assuming that someone is already a pastor, what exactly would it take, or what exactly is required so that he would be obligated to step down, right? And honestly, the Bible doesn't really address this issue per se. I mean, yeah, there are qualifications given in First Timothy chapter 3 as well as in Titus chapter 1 about who's the kind of person that we should be ordaining, right? And it kind of gives us a list or a guideline of the kinds of qualities that we expect when we basically send someone into the ministry, right? Someone that's like vigilant, sober, good behavior, someone that's like apt to teach, not given to wine, different things like that, ruling his house well, right? And if a man know not how to rule his own house, how should he take care of the church of God? And so that kind of gives us an idea of kind of like, okay, this is what we're looking for in terms of what a pastor should be like, right? And so the assumption would be like, he already has a wife, he already has kids, and he has a family, and he's ruling them. And then therefore, this is the guy that would be a candidate for potentially becoming a pastor, right? That's what the qualifications are for. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that if you just simply don't follow every single one of those qualifications, or there's like a certain season in time where you're not doing that good in one of those, that therefore you're just, automatically like, you have to step down, or something like that, right? And honestly, the Bible just doesn't address this topic. It doesn't really discuss, let's say, a scenario or a specific topic of like, a pastor should step down or resign due to X, Y, or Z reasons. Okay. And what's interesting is that we do know one specific scenario in the Bible, specifically King David. And what happened with King David was that he committed two very grievous sins. Of course, the first sin that he did was obviously committing adultery with Bathsheba, right? Sleeping with another man's wife is obviously a very horrible offense. The Bible condemns that, even with the death penalty. So obviously, it's not something that's just kind of a, just kind of a whatever thing, like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. No, adultery is a horrible sin. It's one of the worst sins ever, right? It merits the death penalty. And in addition to that as well, we also know that the other sin that David committed was that he murdered someone. He killed Uriah the Hittite by sending him forth into the hardest part of the battle. And so we know that David was guilty of those really, really grievous, horrible sins. And I guarantee that, as of today, I guarantee if you were to talk to someone or a fellow Christian, hey, if a pastor was caught, committing adultery, or if a pastor was caught, committing murder, do you think that pastor should step down? And virtually everyone would say yes, because it's like, that's like, look, if any sin disqualifies a pastor, it should be something like that, right? And of course, we know that David wasn't exactly a pastor per se, but he was in a very prestigious, a position of leadership, right? He was the king of Israel, right? And even though he was the king of Israel, even though he committed those specific sins that are, again, very grievous, very evil, obviously, yet for some reason, God was still willing to allow him to continue being the king of Israel, even though he was guilty of these specific sins. Now, on the flip side, when we think about King Saul specifically, who arguably enough probably committed sins that were actually not as bad as what David did, right? Because obviously, when you're someone that's stubborn, you show up late and you offer a sacrifice that is only something that the priest should be doing, and when God gives you a command to slaughter all the Amalekites, and you end up sparing some of them and not really fully following through with that commandment, that might not seem as bad as, let's say, sleeping with someone's wife and killing an innocent person, right? Like, it might not exactly be as bad as those sins, and I don't think it was as bad as those sins were, right? I would say that, yeah, murdering people and committing adultery is obviously much worse than just showing up late and offering a sacrifice that wasn't meant for you to be, right? Instead of waiting for Samuel to show up, he actually just took things into his own hands and did something that was not meant for him. It was not suitable for him to do those things. But either way, the point is that even though those sins weren't as bad as what David was doing, yet we know that obviously, Saul was the king of Israel, and in virtue of the fact that he was, neglecting the word of the Lord, he didn't follow through with the commandment of the Lord, and he was stubborn about it, he was unrepentant about it, what ended up happening to him? Well, basically he was deposed from that specific authority, right? He basically said, hey, I'm going to pick someone else. I have someone else chosen that's going to basically take your spot, because you're basically, it's over. You're not going to be the king of Israel anymore, right? And obviously, Saul was pretty upset about that, and that's, on the one hand, it's kind of understandable, but at the same time, it's like he kind of brought that on himself because of his horrible sins, right? So even though both of them were the kings of Israel, right? David and Saul. And even though both of them committed pretty bad sins, pretty horrible sins, right? And arguably David committed much worse sins than Saul did. But at the same time, David was allowed to continue reigning as the king of Israel. And at the same time, Saul was not, allowed to continue reigning. But he basically said that, hey, you're going to get replaced. I repented from making you king over Israel, and it's not going to have someone else take your place or to take your spot, right? So basically, the point I'm making here is that what I think is interesting is that really, the fact that King David was still allowed to continue reigning and to continue being the king of Israel, even though he did those horrible sins like adultery and murder, that seems to give us maybe a little bit of a glimpse or kind of a little bit of a perspective when it comes to whether or not a pastor should or must step down if he were to commit similar sins, whether that's adultery or murder or something like that, right? And so, obviously, I'm not at all suggesting that, that pastors that do those sins, we should just just give them a little slap on the wrist and just pretend like everything's okay. Obviously, those sins have to be exposed. Obviously, those sins need to be rebuked. They have to be dealt with. The Bible says them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. And so they have to get dealt with according to the proper authorities, right? If it was a criminal kind of thing, then yeah, obviously that pastor should be, taken to the law, right? If a pastor committed murder, for example, obviously he should be arrested, he should be thrown in jail and punished to the fullest extent of the law. And at the same time, if a pastor were to commit some other kind of criminal offense, then he should definitely, be, basically just given to the proper authorities, right? That kind of goes without saying. But my point is that I don't think it's necessarily, I don't think it's a requirement. I don't think it's like a commandment of God that a pastor must step down just because he committed adultery or just because he committed murder or any other particular sin, regardless of how grievous it is. Okay, that's basically what I'm saying, and I'm kind of deriving that based off my understanding of what happened with King David as well as King Saul. That being said, I'm not saying that a pastor doesn't need to step down. I'm not saying that there's never a situation where a pastor does need to step down, but I do feel like this is the kind of subject where it kind of lends itself to Christian liberty, and Christians can have different opinions or different perspectives on when and how and what will be the circumstances where it would make sense for a pastor to step down. And I do feel like this is the kind of situation where Christians can have opinions on it. They could say like, hey, I think it's a good idea if he steps down, if he did X, Y, and Z. No, I don't think he needs to step down if he were to be doing X, Y, Z or whatever. They can have differences of opinions on it. They can have ideas about it, perspectives on it. But I don't think it's something where it's like a commandment of God, if that makes sense. I don't think it's something where it's just like, everyone's bound by a specific rule or a perspective when it comes to when a pastor like must step down, right? Now, that being said, at the end of the day, when it comes to a pastor stepping down, obviously, if the congregation is there, and let's say the other leadership of the church, as far as like the staff and the deacons and the men of the church, if they're basically pretty much on the same page, agreeing that, yeah, this pastor needs to step down, he needs to, because they don't deem him to be fit, they don't think that he's right with God, they don't think he's ruling his household or whatever, and if they believe, as the church, that pastor should step down, then at that point I would just say it's a church issue, and at the end of the day the pastor should respect what the congregants and what the staff of the church want, right? Because at the end of the day, even though someone's a pastor, the Bible says that they must give account, and what that means is that they are accountable for the actions that they do or not do. And so if a pastor were to commit a horrible sin, like in the case of Roger Jimenez, the fact that Oliver thought that he should step down, the fact that his wife thought that he should step down, the fact that the people that were familiar with this sin and were that understood what the capability of this sin was, the fact that the only person really that said that he didn't really need to step down was this weird lawyer guy that says that, supposedly that some random dude in the jungle can get saved without knowing about Jesus or something, like just some weird heresy like that. But that being said, my point is that at that point, whether or not a pastor should step down if he's guilty of some kind of really bad sin, I think at the end of the day, that should be a church issue, and that's something that they need to deal with, right? So in other words, let's just say, just to give an example, right? Let's say there was a pastor and he's found out to have done a horrible sin. Let's say adultery, right? Like just a very common sin that pastors might be guilty of, right? If he were caught sleeping with another man's wife, and if it was found out and we proved it, and it's without a shadow of a doubt that that's what he did, right, beyond reasonable doubt, if the church strongly believes, right, if the men of the church, if the staff of the church or whatever, if they come to a conclusion and they say like, hey, look, even though he did this horrible sin, even though it was evil, even though it was wrong, hey, the pastor is repentant about it, he believes that what he did was wrong, he has remorse about his sin, he took steps against that sin after it happened, he stopped contact with this woman, and he doesn't text her anymore, he doesn't call her anymore, he just completely cut contact with this woman, and he's not spending time with her, and this pastor is even going through like marriage counseling and working through that situation and taking actionable steps to in a sense like mend the horrible sin that he did or the effects of that sin, and because he's repentant, he's actually making progress and actually fixing this issue, we believe that he should still continue pastoring, because even though he's did this horrible sin, we still think he's redeemable. We still feel like he's like a King David in that sense, right? Like, yeah, King David committed adultery and murder, but hey, he was repentant. He said, hey, I've sinned against the Lord, and he wanted to make things right. And in the same way, God forbid if a pastor were to commit a sin like adultery, if that pastor was repentant and he felt like, hey, I sinned against the Lord, this is wrong, I should not have done something like this, and if the congregation of that church decided like, hey, we want to keep this pastor pastoring, we want him to still be our pastor because he's repentant and we feel like we can actually redeem him, right? Then who are we as people that are outside of that situation to tell them that no, that pastor should step down because he committed adultery, right? But even then, God didn't tell King David to step down, or that someone else is going to take over, King David as a result of the sin that he committed, or something like that, right? That just simply isn't the case. So that being said, I personally, it's not something I really have a strong opinion about, but I'm just simply saying that regardless of what happens in a specific church, whether it's a scandal or something else or what have you, at the end of the day, if the congregation of that church, as far as like the men of the church, the staff or whatever, if they come to a conclusion, if they feel like, hey, look, we don't want this guy pastoring us anymore because he did this horrible sin and it's just unredeemable, or if they look at that same situation and that same pastor and they come to a different conclusion and they say, no, we want him to keep pastoring because we feel like he can make things right and try to redeem the situation, then at the end of the day, that's ultimately the church's decision. So it's not my decision, it's not your decision. At the end of the day, it's the church's decision to figure out that specific situation, and basically, work out a solution for that. So that's more or less my personal opinion. Obviously, it's not like doctrine. This is just what I personally believe. It's more so just kind of my perspective, uh, my educated opinion, if you will. And obviously, if you see things a bit differently, you're more than welcome to just kind of send me a leave a comment, or reach out to me if you have my number or what have you. We can kind of discuss things a little bit more. But that's my personal perspective. You don't have to agree with it, but just wanted to just let you guys know. But anyway, have a great day. God bless.